we've lived for years now with affirmative action, as you know, and it's just got more extreme. I mean, here's a recent example from the Australian National University, offering jobs in space research just for women. No men may apply, not a one of them, even if they're an Einstein. Well, in America, its highest court, the Supreme Court, looks set to junk this kind of affirmative action, at least when it's on the grounds of race, and make it illegal, as it should be. A group called Students for Fair Admissions wants the court to rule against Harvard and another university using affirmative action to let in black students rather than Asian and Jewish students in particular who have better grades. Affirmative action, you're of the wrong race, you of the right race, things like that. Now, this sure doesn't seem fair on some bright kids who studied hard, but many on the left say it's racist not to be this racist because diversity is healthy. Joining me is Annelise Nielsen, Sky News US correspondent. Annelise, always great to see you. This case seems to be a real dagger in the heart, or it's aimed at the heart of the affirmative action movement, that you should be picking people on the basis of race or gender or sexual preference or whatever it is. It seems to me that it is causing a lot of ructions over there.
Look, this is going to have really serious ramifications if this case comes through. When you're talking about not allowing affirmative action for universities, that's been a huge push, especially over the last few years, since those summer of riots, the murder of George Floyd. But it also turns to a broader issue in the United States about how they can push ahead opportunities for people of colour when they haven't had those opportunities before. But when you're talking about the higher education system in the US, there's some serious systemic issues. There's over $1.3 trillion of student loan debt in the country. And we heard even today, I was at an event with Stacey Abrams on the hustings for governor, and she made mention of this, where she said that everyone who wants to go to college should have the opportunity. And she even made mention of the fact that she said we want to get C students into colleges at whatever it costs, and that the government should be there to pick that up. And it kind of goes back to this whole argument about what is higher education for, if not to be the most academically competitive forum and not to help you get a job afterwards. If you're loading these kids up with debt and they didn't have the grades to be in an academically competitive position in the first place, how are they ever going to manage that? And we've had this debt forgiveness program come through the Biden administration. It's going to cost them an absolute fortune. And at the end of the day, what substantive difference is it going to make?
I wonder whether affirmative action and the whole politics of race has become a really entrenched industry that is going to be really hard to shift. Because I note that the Supreme Court actually ruled 19 years ago at first, yes, okay, they could have these affirmative action programs, but they should be just temporary. It said, the judgment at the time said, we expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary. But the university seemed to be saying they have no plans to phase out racial preferences when picking students in their campuses. And there's no sign when they say that the job will be done.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea that you can reverse centuries of mistreatment of African Americans in 25 years of this program is kind of laughable in itself. But one of the other interesting aspects of this is looking at who brought this. It's its own kind of injustice when you're going against other minorities by saying that they're overrepresented, that there's too many successful Asian Americans going for these courses, and so their numbers need to be limited to make space for others, when they're the ones who, maybe it's cultural, do the work, they make the grades, and why deny it based off that objective measure to say that they shouldn't get that opportunity compared to someone who isn't as academically competitive? When we're talking about universities, it's an academically competitive space. So that's an interesting proposition that's probably going to advantage this one group that in its own way has been disadvantaged. But how much can you social engineer any of it is the real question. And I mean, that idea that in 25 years you could fix it is pretty laughable.
Annelise, the midterm elections in America are next week. It's to decide whether the Democrats can keep control of both houses of Congress, House of Reps and the Senate. It's looking bad for the Democrats, with cost of living issues hurting them, Joe Biden hurting them. His popularity is dangerously low, and He was again yesterday just rambling and telling the most amazing untruths.
Inflation is a worldwide problem right now because of a war in Iraq and the impact on oil and what Russia's doing. The war in Ukraine. And thinking of Iraq because that's where my son died.
In fact, Joe Biden's son died in the United States, not in Iraq, and he died of a brain tumour, not of war injuries. How bad is Biden for the Democrats?
Look, they're not using him, and that's probably the best indicator. He's had very limited impact on the campaign. We've probably seen more of Donald Trump out campaigning for his candidates at rallies than we've seen of Joe Biden. It's massively ramping up as we have this 1 week to go, and this is going to be drawn out. It's going to take days after polling day for us to get a result in some of these states because of the changes to voting after 2020. But Joe Biden is not being put forward by any of the candidates we've seen in key swing states. We've been in Nevada now, Arizona, Pennsylvania. Now we're in Georgia. We're planning to go back to Pennsylvania because there's going to be a big weekend with Biden, Barack Obama and Trump all out at the same time, showing just how critical that state is. But you don't hear these Democrats in tough races bringing up Joe Biden or the Biden campaign, the Biden administration and what they've done. If anything, you hear them trying to distance themselves from energy policy. It's really unpopular, especially in places like Nevada and Arizona where cost of living is bad. And I have to say, in the limited time I've been in Georgia, you can tell the economy here is doing quite well. There's not the help wanted signs everywhere. Petrol is low. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the governor, Brian Kemp, kept the state open during the pandemic. They didn't have those lockdowns. They didn't have those ongoing flow-on effects. And that is a popular thing he can lean into now. So he doesn't have to lean into the Trump politics. He doesn't have to address that. Even when he's out with Pence today, they were both cast off by the Trump administration, and they could stand there and say, we're conservatives. And the polling has him more than 6 points ahead of Stacey Abrams.
You mentioned Donald Trump. I'm out of time, but I'd like to hear about your view here. He's planning to run again in 2 years, but has now come under fire from his former and loyal Vice President, Mike Pence, who's also wanting to run. Tell us about Pence.
This is a really tricky line for Pence to walk. He's the guy that certified the election result when Trump specifically told him not to on multiple occasions. He wanted his support and he backed away from him. We're getting this memoir now from Pence, and he's saying that it was some of the worst days of his life was those last few days of the Trump administration after a few years he was really proud of. Now, he made mention of that today when he was out with Brian Kemp, saying, I did a lot that I'm proud of. We succeeded a lot in trade policy that was important. We had the economy strong. But it's a really toxic proposition for him because there are a lot of people that still support Donald Trump. They are a big part of the base. And whereas a candidate like, if you had a Ron DeSantis run, can distance themselves from that, say, not my circus, not my monkeys kind of thing. When you've got Pence, it's a direct issue with how he handled it. But if he can attach himself to candidates like Kemp, who are successful at the polls, maybe he does have a chance. It's still incredibly messy, and it's an uncomfortable proposition for the Republicans to have to face when the race for the White House starts again, which will really start quite earnestly after the midterm elections.
Well, that'll in fact depend a little bit on how well Trump's hand-picked candidates do in this election. Annelise Nielsen, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.